Why was the medic still standing when the entire base had fallen? The question hung like smoke in the early morning air, unanswered, as the world around burned. Hours before Commander's rescue team would arrive, before reports would later write her name in medals and histories, Lieutenant Angel had been nothing more than a quiet presence in the medical bay. She was not a commander, not a strategist, not the kind of soldier expected to alter the course of survival. And yet, in the darkest hour, when the base collapsed under fire, every desperate heartbeat seemed to beat around her. It began at exactly 4:00 a.m., the hour when soldiers sleep heaviest, when the body trusts silence, and fear hides beneath layers of fatigue. The first rocket tore into the compound with a shriek that seemed to split night apart. The comms tower took the brunt, flames spiraling upward like a beacon calling for death. Had been alone with boxes of gauze and surgical packs, her eyes scanning lists no one else cared about, when the windows imploded and she was thrown against steel. Her body jolted, air ripped from her lungs, ears ringing with a high, merciless pitch. For a moment she lay there, pressed against the cold floor, asking herself if this was how it ended, not in bravery, not in action, but on her back among scattered instruments. She blinked, tasting blood at the corner of her mouth, and forced herself up. Her hands shook as they found the cabinet's edge, her breath ragged. The alarm wailed, a mechanical voice declaring a warning that came too late. Incoming! Incoming! Personnel to stations. And then the second strike landed, obliterating the command post in a single, deafening concussion. Staggered toward the nearest cot as the floor rolled like water beneath her boots. The infirmary ceiling rattled with falling tiles. Her head throbbed. A voice screamed outside, then another, then silence cut them down. She pressed her palm against the counter to steady herself. Her training whispered through the chaos: breathe, assess, act. She was not a soldier with a rifle. She was a medic. Her weapon was steadiness. Her was blood and bone. The third missile hit the barracks. A roar, then the long groan of metal tearing. She felt it in her ribs, like something trying to crush her from the inside out. The power grid snapped dead. Red backup lights flickered alive, draping the medical bay in shadows that danced against the smoke curling through vents. The door slammed open. A soldier stumbled in, uniform shredded, blood painting his chest. Behind him came two more, dragging a third, unconscious, his head wrapped in crimson. "Medic," one of them gasped and collapsed against the wall. Her body stopped shaking. "On the table," she ordered, voice cutting through the ringing in her ears. "Apply pressure. You get gauze packs." Her fingers found the wound before fear could. Training was faster than thought, and with each heartbeat she remembered who she was. The wounded kept coming. With every blast that shook the compound, another man staggered into her care. Shrapnel tore uniforms, burned scorched skin, some limped, some crawled. Some didn't move at all until dragged by brothers who refused to leave them behind. The infirmary filled too quickly, too heavily. Beds ran out. Floor space vanished. Air thickened with smoke and iron. "Ma'am," said a voice from the doorway. Corporal David, his face streaked with soot, clutching a bleeding arm. "Command post is gone. Fire controls are gone. This is the only building left." His eyes swept across the room. Supplies dwindled as fast as hope. Dozens of hands reached for her. Pain moaned from every corner. Somewhere above, the roof groaned like it wanted to collapse. She said, pulling a bandage tight, "We're moving the worst cases downstairs. Storage basement, concrete walls." "Basement, but shouldn't we try to get out, make a run for it?" She looked through shattered panes at the inferno raging outside. Vehicles burned in skeletal frames. Ammunition stores detonated in bursts that painted the dawn red. Shells kept falling with brutal precision, each one burying the possibility of escape deeper in smoke. "There's nowhere to run," she answered softly. "We stay, we keep them breathing, that's our mission now." The basement had never been meant for human lives, just crates, tools, forgotten spare parts. But the walls were thick, reinforced to hold against fire and weight. If the base had a heart still beating, it was hidden there. Organized quickly. Walking wounded help carry stretchers. Prioritize head injuries first. Move. Private Aaron Cole shouted from across the ward, voice breaking through the roar of distant fire. Roof, giving way in the east wing. Then move faster, snapped. How many left? 6 walking, 3 on stretchers. Her chest burned with every inhale of smoke, but she refused to cough. Every second mattered. Decisions cut at her like blades. Who to lift, who to drag, who could wait. Battlefield triage was something she'd trained for, but not like this. Not in her own hospital while the ceiling threatened to bury her alive. One by one, they carried men into the basement, setting them on cold concrete floors. Flashlights threw beams against crates and steel pipes. Somewhere above, another missile slammed into what had once been the mess hall. Dust showered from cracks in the ceiling. "Keep low," commanded. "If the building comes down, these walls may hold." Her patients sprawled across the basement. Some whimpered. Some didn't make a sound at all. Blood pooled in shadows, reflecting glints of light like black water. She moved between them without stopping, hands steady even when her knees trembled. Then Sergeant burst down the stairs, face drawn tight. "Serious problem. The whole place is burning, smoke's coming in fast." Paused only long enough to glance at the vents overhead, gray wisps already curling downward. Her mind clicked into calculation. 18 men, half unable to walk. Supplies nearly gone. Fire closing in. "Check the shafts," she ordered. "There's an escape hatch, maintenance tunnels, vehicle sector." "Through that fire." Her eyes hardened. "Then we go through fire." No hesitation, no doubt, the only way was forward. She turned to her patients, her voice sharp and clear. "We're moving again. Listen to me. If you can walk, you carry stretchers. If you can breathe, you help someone who can't. No one stays behind. Do you hear me?" Private Daniel, his head swathed in bandages, raised a trembling hand. "Ma'am, what if they're already here? What if ground troops?" She cut in, kneeling to meet his eyes. "Our mission isn't to fight. Our mission is survival. If they come, we'll deal with them. But right now we move." The crawl through the tunnels stretched into eternity. Narrow passages pressed against shoulders, the air stale and choking. Stretchers scraped along walls. Every few minutes stopped to check a pulse, tighten a bandage, adjust a sling. Her flashlight beam shook, but not from her hand. It was the ground itself, trembling with every explosion above. 45 minutes of crawling. 45 minutes of prayers whispered through clenched teeth. The sound of men in pain. The weight of lives tied to her strength. When they reached the maintenance bunker at last, it felt less like safety and more like a pause between storms. The chamber stretched wide, a cavern built to cradle machines of war. Empty now, except for steel supports and emergency cabinets. Wasted no time. "List what we carried. Coal, check cabinets. Radio, get me someone out there." They scattered, obeying her tone more than her rank. She turned broken wrenches into clamps, used maintenance lights for surgery lamps. Improvised tools became her arsenal. It wasn't medicine as it should be. It was medicine in war, brutal and stripped down, survival measured in heartbeats she refused to let fade. The bombardment above did not stop. It thundered, relentless, like the earth itself was trying to bury them. Each blast shook dust loose from the beams, each echo making men flinch. But beneath the earth's hands never stopped. One life, then the next, then the next. Hours blurred. She didn't know when night ended or if morning ever came. Time dissolved into pulse checks and whispered encouragement. "Stay with me. You're not done yet. Breathe. Good. Just breathe." Corporal crouched by the radio, static hissing in his ears. "Ma'am, I think I've got something. Faint signals. Friendlies trying to break through, but the barrage, it's blocking everything." "How long?" she asked, not looking up from stitching torn flesh. He shook his head. "Could be hours, could be longer." His chest tightened, but she didn't let her hands falter. She pressed the needle through skin, pulled thread taut, tied it off with precision. Hours? These men didn't have hours. Why did the explosions suddenly sound different? It wasn't just the roar of artillery anymore. Somewhere above the pounding of shells came another sound, heavier, metallic, crawling, tracks grinding across concrete, engines growling like predators closing in. Froze mid-suture, her needle poised over Sergeant's chest wound, and listened. The others heard it too. Men stirred uneasily, eyes darting to the ceiling as if they could see through tons of soil and steel. Vehicles, muttered. His face was pale beneath soot. Ground forces, they're here. His pulse hammered in her throat. Artillery was faceless, distant. But ground troops meant footsteps, rifles, the cold breath of an enemy close enough to whisper death. She tied off the suture with steady fingers, though her insides churned. What do we have left for defense? Counted grimly. 4 rifles, barely 2 magazines of ammo, sidearms with a handful of rounds each. That's it. That wasn't defense. That was a delay at best. Looked around at her patients. 18 men scattered across the floor, some breathing shallow, some unconscious, some clinging to life by a thread she alone held. They were soldiers, but not now. Not like this. Right now they were fragile, broken, more vulnerable than they'd ever been. If enemy boots reached this bunker, it would be execution, not battle. She forced herself to speak evenly. We set a perimeter, walking wounded up front. Deep cases stay low and quiet. You'll coordinate, I'll keep working. No hesitation in her voice, but her chest tightened. She wasn't trained to lead defenses. She was trained to stop bleeding, restart hearts. Yet now she had to be both medic and shield. The hours dragged. Every minute stretched thin by the grinding of enemy engines above, the occasional burst of foreign shouts carried through vents. She kept working through it, refusing to let her hands shake. If she faltered, they lost more than battles. They lost lives. Then sometime past midnight the sound shifted again. Boots, heavy, measured, too close. Cole was at the bunker entrance, a rifle propped against his unsteady shoulder. His whisper cracked like brittle glass. "Ma'am, they're getting closer." His eyes lifted from her patient. The air itself seemed to thicken, heavy with anticipation. She checked her watch. 200 hours. 10 hours since the first strike. 10 hours since began to die. The footsteps stopped above. Silence pressed in, louder than the bombardment. Then clang, metal stairwell, boots descending. "Stay quiet," whispered, her voice like a knife in the dark. "Don't move, don't breathe unless you have to." Every soldier held still. Even the wounded seemed to understand silence was survival. The door crashed open. 3 enemy soldiers stormed in, rifles raised, their eyes sweeping across the bunker. Rose to her feet, instinct dragging her forward before fear could root her. She stood between them and her patients, shoulders squared though her knees trembled. One soldier barked in a language she couldn't follow. Another stepped closer, his gaze narrowing on her. Then the leader spoke, broken English threading through his accent. "American doctor." Swallowed, forcing calm into her voice. "Lieutenant, U.S. Army Medical Corps. These men are under my care." The soldiers scanned the bunker. Their eyes lingered on stretchers, on the improvised tools, on bodies too still to move. One muttered something sharp to the others. The leader's weapon shifted, its barrel pointing not at her, but at the wounded behind her. "You come, soldiers, stay." Her stomach clenched. "They need me, I won't abandon them." The soldier stepped closer, raising the muzzle to the chest of a soldier lying unconscious nearby. His words were clear this time, each one heavy. "You come now, or we shoot them." Her lungs felt frozen. If she left, her patients lost the only one who could keep them alive. If she refused, they would die right here, right now. "Wait," her voice broke before she steadied it. "I'll go, but let me stabilize the critical ones first. 5 minutes." The soldiers exchanged a look. After a tense pause, the leader nodded. Moved quickly, almost frantically, her hands flying from patient to patient. Pain meds injected, wounds rebandaged, Words whispered in ears half-conscious. "Hold on, Commander is coming. Hours maybe, not long, you'll live, you have to." She bent close to, "If they don't bring me back, you're in charge, keep them breathing, whatever it takes." Gripped her wrist. "Ma'am, what if they're taking you to be shot?" "Then you lead," she said quietly. "Promise me, keep them alive until comes." And then she was gone. The soldiers marched her through the wreckage past husks of vehicles still burning, past what had once been barracks and command towers now reduced to smoldering heaps. The compound looked like a graveyard of steel and ash. Her boots crunched over broken glass and debris as flames clawed upward into what should have been dawn. They brought her to the only building still standing, its roof caved but walls upright. Inside waited an officer older, with a sharpness in his eyes that made her stomach knot. His English was clearer, precise. "Lieutenant," he said evenly, "I am Major Victor. You will treat our wounded." Her jaw clenched. "I'll give care under Geneva rules, but my soldiers need me. They can't." "Your men are prisoners. They will be treated when it suits us. For now, you will treat ours." He gestured to rows of injured enemy soldiers, groaning in corners, bleeding into makeshift bandages. His throat burned. Her oath demanded she treat the wounded any wounded, but every second she gave here was another second her 18 men went without care. She closed her eyes briefly, searching for resolve, and forced herself forward. She would treat these soldiers. She would do her duty, but her heart stayed in that bunker. Hours passed in a blur of blood and commands barked in a language she didn't understand. Her hands stitched enemy flesh, set enemy bones, pushed enemy IVs. But her mind never left the faces waiting underground. Were they slipping away? Was chest wound bleeding again? Was still unconscious, or was his silence something worse? At 600 hours, 12 hours since the first strike, a new sound split the air. The low thunder of helicopter rotors. American. Froze mid-bandage. She met's eyes, her voice sharp. "Major, those are U.S. aircraft." His expression didn't waver. "Yes, Lieutenant, now we negotiate." Outside, rescue had come. Commander's team had broken through. But rescue didn't mean freedom, not yet. For the hardest hours were only beginning. What if rescue wasn't salvation, but another trap? The thought pressed hard against his chest as the thump of American helicopters shook the ground. For a moment, hope flared sharp, intoxicating. Her men were still alive down in that bunker, waiting for. The sound of rotors should have meant deliverance. But here she was, standing in a half-collapsed enemy outpost, blood up to her wrists, surrounded by soldiers who looked at her not as a medic, not even as a human being, but as a bargaining chip. Major didn't flinch at the arrival of American forces. His face was stone, his voice calm as if the aircraft were nothing more than background noise. "Commander will surround this compound," he said matter-of-factly. "He will demand the release of his wounded, and we will decide how this ends." His heart pounded. "My men can't wait for talks. Some will die if I don't get back to them now." His eyes narrowed with a kind of cold amusement. "You speak of time as if it belongs to you. It belongs to me, Lieutenant. You will stay until my terms are met." She wanted to scream at him, to push past his guards and run back across the burning compound. But there was nowhere to run. His men outnumbered her, rifles always within reach. So she swallowed the scream and forced her voice steady. "Then let me work. If I can treat your wounded, I buy time for mine." And so the hours dragged. She moved among enemy bodies, patching them, stitching, pushing back infection. Her hands performed the motions they knew by heart, but her mind kept circling the bunker, whose chest wound was unstable, concussed, slipping deeper into silence. Cole, fighting fever in the dark. Every moment away was another life sliding closer to an edge. When the guards weren't watching too closely, she glanced out shattered windows. Through smoke she saw shadows of perimeter, the silhouettes of American helmets, the outlines of rifles in defensive arcs. They were close. Close enough that if she shouted, maybe they'd hear. But if she drew attention to herself, the rifles inside would turn on her patients first. Negotiations began at dawn. Voices carried through radio channels, clipped and formal. Major Kame's voice, steady, commanding. "This is Commander James of the United States Navy. We are here to evacuate our wounded. We demand immediate release." Closed her eyes at the sound of it. A voice of reason, of authority, the sound of someone who believed she was more than a hostage. Leaned close to his transmitter, his tone measured. "Commander, we have 18 of your injured men. We have your medic. They are alive because we allow it. If you want them, we negotiate." Silence fell in the room. Stomach twisted. She was alive because he allowed it. No, she was alive because she refused to give in, because she kept moving when everything else burned. But's voice stayed calm. "We are willing to discuss. But know this, if a single one of my soldiers dies while you delay, this ends differently." The tension between their voices coiled like barbed wire. For 2 hours the talks went back and forth, bargains made, threats implied, all whilst hands stayed busy on men who were not hers. Finally she snapped, her voice cracking across the silence. "Major, I need to see my patients. They've gone 6 hours without treatment. Some won't survive another one." His gaze was ice. "You will stay until talks are settled." Her fists clenched. She could feel the beat of her own pulse in her temples. How many times had she whispered to her men that was coming? How many times had she promised they'd hold out? Promises meant nothing if she wasn't there to keep them alive. Then suddenly the radio crackled again. Not's voice, not someone else. "Lieutenant, do you copy?" Her breath caught. Daniel's voice faint, strained, but alive. Somehow the battered radio in the bunker had broken through. She almost answered but bit her tongue. If she spoke, her captors would know. If she stayed silent, might think she'd abandoned them. Her nails dug into her palms as the conflict tore at her. Broke the moment. His voice carried across the channel like a lifeline. "Major, here's my counter. Medical personnel and wounded from both sides receive immediate care. Lieutenant returns to treat her men. Your doctors handle yours. You want negotiations? Fine. But they happen while lives are being saved." The silence after was long. His jaw tightened. His pride bristled. But even he knew an untreated soldier was a liability, not a bargaining chip. Finally, with a sharp exhale, he nodded to his men. "Take her back." Relief hit so hard her knees almost buckled. She didn't care if it was a trick. Didn't care if guards followed her every step. All that mattered was the tunnel, the bunker, the 18 faces waiting for her. When she burst back into the chamber, the smell of sickness and sweat hit her like a wall. Men stirred weakly, eyes opening with disbelief. Rose instantly, voice thick with exhaustion. "Ma'am, we thought." She dropped to her knees beside before he could finish. His chest wound had reopened, blood soaking through makeshift dressings. "Scissors," she ordered sharply. "Clamp, IV, now." Her hands worked furiously, pushing pain meds, stitching through flesh that barely held. Cole lay nearby, his skin hot to the touch, fever raging. She forced fluids, whispered reassurances, her mind splitting into a dozen channels at once. Cole, the others. One by one she pulled them back from the edge, her voice steady even as her heart ached. Hours passed in a blur of sweat and urgency. Above, helicopters circled. Outside, negotiations dragged. But in here fought a different war, one of seconds, one of breaths, one of fragile threads tying men to life. At last, his voice reached her again through static. "Lieutenant, stand by. The exchange is set. You and your men are cleared for medevac." She exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands slowed, just for a moment, trembling at last under the weight of relief. But as she looked around at the faces on the floor, gaunt and pale, she knew the story wasn't victory yet. Not until every stretcher was loaded. Not until the rotors carried them away from ruin. And so she pushed herself back to her feet. She said softly, "Let's get them home. What if the exchange collapsed before it began?" The question clung to his mind as the hours bled into one another. The air in the maintenance bunker was heavy with smoke and sickness. Her hands were raw from bandages, her voice hoarse from constant orders and whispered reassurances. Yet her eyes kept flicking toward the stairwell, toward the faint sound of movement above. Rescue was near and too fragile. At last lowered his radio with a solemn nod. "Ma'am," says, "the exchange is set. They'll start moving men in 1 hour." 1 hour, felt her stomach knot. Didn't have an hour, neither did Cole. Was still unconscious, his shallow breaths rattling like brittle paper. She pressed her palm to his chest, feeling the fragile rhythm beneath. "We hold them together," she murmured. "1 more hour, just 1 more." The bunker seemed to listen. Every soldier lay still, as if afraid movement itself might break the thin thread of survival. Even the walking wounded stayed quiet, rifles clutched loosely in hands too weak for trigger pulls. The silence was oppressive, not peace, but anticipation. Then footsteps again, but not enemy, familiar American. The door swung open, blinding light flooding the chamber. For an instant shielded her eyes, heart leaping until she saw the silhouettes. American helmets, friendlies. Relief hit her like water after fire. "Lieutenant," a voice called. "Commander's orders, we're here to escort the wounded." Her throat tightened. For a second she couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. Then she managed a nod, pushing her exhaustion down deep. "Move fast," she ordered. "We can't afford hesitation. Get stretchers ready. Stabilize those who can't walk. No one gets left behind." It began slowly, like the first cautious steps across a frozen river. Enemy soldiers stood guard near the stairwell, rifles still trained, suspicion carved into their faces. Behind them, American forces moved with equal tension, weapons slung low but ready. Every glance felt like a trigger waiting to be pulled. Hovered over each stretcher as her men were lifted, adjusting IV lines, checking pulses, whispering encouragement. "You're going home. Just hold on. You're not done yet." Cole groaned as he was lifted, fever burning through his skin. "Ma'am," his voice was a rasp, "we're really out." She squeezed his hand steady. "Yes, you're going home. Don't quit now." The hand twitched weakly in hers before slipping limp again. Panic stabbed at her chest until she pressed 2 fingers to his neck and found the pulse faint but there. She exhaled sharply. "Go, move him." The exchange unfolded under the watch of both sides. American helicopters hovered beyond the compound, rotors thrumming like impatient hearts. The enemy lined their wounded opposite the Americans, grim bargaining chips laid out on stretchers of their own. Each transfer was deliberate, precise. 1 man out, another man in. His voice carried through the radio with the calm of a man walking a tightrope. "Major, this continues only if both sides honor the agreement. A single betrayal ends it all." Watched his face from a distance as he gave curt nods, his jaw locked in steel restraint. She couldn't read him, couldn't tell if this was strategy, pride, or something darker. All she knew was that every minute dragged like a blade across her nerves. At one point, a guard's rifle shifted, barrel rising a fraction higher. Every American soldier tensed instantly, weapons cocked, fingers hovering on triggers. His heart stopped. One wrong move and the floor would run red. "Stand down," she hissed, her voice sharper than she intended. The guard glanced at her, surprised, then lowered his weapon. Slowly, the tension eased. But the lesson was clear. The exchange was no rescue. It was a gamble. Finally, after endless minutes, stretcher was lifted last. Walked beside him, one hand pressed against his bandaged chest, feeling the weak flutter beneath. She would not let him slip away now. When they reached the open air, the world hit her in a rush. Smoke still hung over ruins. Fire still smoldered in blackened shells of buildings. The ground was littered with twisted steel, shattered glass, the bones of a base that no longer existed. Above it all, American helicopters hovered, lowering lines and stretchers. Their blades tore the smoke into ribbons. Their roar was the sound of survival. stood at the perimeter, his uniform streaked with ash, his eyes sharp as they found her. For the first time his voice softened. "Lieutenant." She didn't stop moving, didn't pause for acknowledgement. She guided Stretcher to the helicopter, shouted instructions to medics waiting inside. "Monitor vitals every 2 minutes. Keep his chest elevated. If he crashes, open the kit immediately." Only when was secured did she step back. Her body swayed with exhaustion, but her gaze stayed locked on the line of stretchers still waiting. One by one, she oversaw them all, until every last man was lifted aboard. When the final helicopter rose into the sky, felt something she hadn't allowed herself since the first strike at 4:00 a.m. relief. Real, bone-deep relief. But it wasn't triumph, it wasn't victory, it was something quieter, something heavier. As the last helicopter vanished beyond the smoke, she stood amid the ruins of. The silence was deafening now that the bombardment had stopped, broken only by the crackle of flames consuming what little remained. She thought of the comms tower that had fallen in the first blast, of the barracks where men had died in their sleep, of the command post obliterated before anyone could issue orders. She thought of the faces she hadn't been able to save. Approached slowly, his boots crunching over broken stone. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "what you did here was extraordinary. You kept 18 alive under conditions no one else could endure." Her throat ached. She looked at him, her eyes hollow with fatigue. "Sir, I just kept them breathing, that's all." "Sometimes," he said softly, "that's the difference between a massacre and a miracle." She wanted to believe him, but all she could see was the fire chewing through his bones. They loaded her last after every patient had been secured. As the helicopter lifted, she pressed herself against the frame, eyes locked on the ruins below. Every blast mark, every twisted beam, every shadowed crater was carved into her memory. Was gone, but 18 men weren't. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Why did silence feel heavier than explosions? For 12 hours had known only fire, screaming, and the endless percussion of artillery. But in the helicopter, with rotors beating steady overhead, the absence of chaos pressed on her chest harder than the rubble ever had. The flight to the field hospital blurred into a haze of motion and murmurs. Medics leaned over stretchers, IV bags swayed, vitals monitors beeped in rhythmic protests. Sat wedged between two patients on one side, Cole on the other, her hands moving automatically from pulse to bandage to line. She had no room for rest, no space for collapse, not yet. His pressures dropping, a medic across from her shouted. Was already leaning over, pressing firm against the dressing over his chest wound. "Clamp, keep him elevated. He's fragile, but he's here. Don't let him slip." Her voice carried steel, though inside she was unraveling thread by thread. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to keep the tremor out of her hands. Her men watched her even in their weakness. They needed her to be unshakable. She would not let them see the weight pressing her down. The helicopter lurched, turbulence rattling metal against metal. Someone groaned, steadied herself, her hand gripping a stretcher rail so hard her knuckles blanched. Minutes blurred into more minutes. Then the pilot's voice cut through the roar. "Approaching field hospital, prepare for offload." Relief should have come, but instead felt only dread. Because for the first time since the attack began, her role was shifting. She wasn't the only medic anymore. She wasn't the one between life and death. She would have to let go. The doors opened to blinding light and organized chaos. Dozens of hands reached in, lifting stretchers, barking orders, moving patients with precision. Doctors in clean uniforms, nurses with fresh gloves, orderlies with carts and monitors. A world of resources hadn't seen in what felt like years. She followed Stretcher into the triage tent, refusing to be pushed aside. "He's critical," she snapped at the surgeon preparing to take over. "Through and through chest wound, compromised twice during bombardment, pressure unstable, keep him elevated. He responds to fluids but crashes fast." The surgeon gave a brisk nod. "We've got him, Lieutenant. Step back." Step back. The word struck harder than shrapnel. Hands hovered, unwilling to let go of the bandage she'd held since the bunker, but she forced herself to release it, watching as new hands replaced hers, clean and sure. She moved to Cole next, rattling off vitals and symptoms until another nurse guided her away. "We've got him, ma'am. Please get yourself checked." Get herself checked. She almost laughed. She couldn't remember if the blood on her uniform was hers or theirs. Maybe both. Her body ached with every step, but she pushed it aside. Pain didn't matter. She wasn't the patient. But the hospital didn't let her hide. A young corpsman intercepted her near the intake station, eyes scanning her smoke-streaked face. "Lieutenant, sit. Now." She wanted to argue, to insist she was fine. But her knees betrayed her, buckling as soon as she lowered herself onto the cot. Her hands trembled uncontrollably now that they had nothing to hold. The corpsman cleaned a cut above her brow, wrapped bruised ribs, pressed a stethoscope against her chest. "Mild concussion, cracked rib, exhaustion. You're lucky you're upright." Gave a hollow smile. Luck had nothing to do with it. As she sat there, the sounds of the triage tent washed over her, controlled, efficient, almost mundane compared to the nightmare she'd crawled out of. Machines beeped. Doctors murmured. Patients cried softly instead of screaming. She should have felt comfort, but instead, a strange emptiness hollowed her out. When the chaos was constant, when every second demanded her hands, she hadn't had time to feel. Now, in the stillness, her chest filled with memories she didn't want. The roar of collapsing roofs, the faces of men she hadn't reached in time, the Wace rifle had hovered over her wounded. Her vision blurred. She didn't realize she was crying until she tasted salt on her lips. "Lieutenant," the voice was steady, grounding, "Commander." She looked up, blinking hard. He stood in his uniform streaked with soot, but his posture still carried authority. "Sir." Her voice cracked and she straightened instinctively. "All 18, they made it." Studied her face for a long moment. "Because of you." Shook her head. "Because they refused to quit, because they carried each other. I just kept them alive long enough." Crouched slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Lieutenant, I've read reports of medics under fire. I've seen combat hospitals after, but I've never seen one medic hold 18 men together through 10 hours of bombardment and 6 hours of captivity. You didn't just keep them alive. You everything stacked against you." His words should have been affirmation. Instead, they felt distant, like praise meant for someone else. She glanced away, whispering more to herself than him. "I left them. When they took me, I left them." His eyes softened. "You came back, that's what matters, and because of you they're all here now." She wanted to believe him. She wanted the weight to lift, but guilt pressed heavier than any metal could. That night the hospital quieted. Machines hummed. Nurses walked softly between cots, sat at the edge of his bed, watching his chest rise and fall beneath fresh bandages. She counted each breath like prayer beads. Across the ward, Cole stirred fitfully, fever breaking under the care of antibiotics she hadn't had. Remained unconscious, but his vitals had steadied. One by one, the 18 men she'd fought for were out of immediate danger. For the first time since, let herself exhale fully. Her body slumped against the cot. Muscles screamed, ribs ached, head pounded, but none of it mattered. She had no medals in her hands, no speeches prepared, only the quiet satisfaction of seeing her men breathe in unison. As she drifted toward sleep, one thought circled endlessly. Survival wasn't triumph. Survival was simply the chance to face tomorrow. And tomorrow, the weight of would still be there. Why did the word hero feel heavier than shrapnel? 6 months had passed since burned, yet the memories hadn't loosened their grip. The smoke, the screams, the flicker of backup lights in the infirmary, they lingered in her dreams, dragging her back each night to the bunker where 18 men clung to her hands like lifelines. In daylight, wore her uniform crisp and clean, her new rank stitched proudly on her chest. Captain Angel. She had been promoted in a ceremony that drew cameras and speeches. Himself had pinned the silver star onto her uniform, his voice ringing with solemn pride. Captain demonstrated valor and resilience beyond the call of duty, he declared before rows of saluting soldiers. She preserved 18 lives against impossible odds, under relentless bombardment and captivity. She is a testament to the spirit of service. Applause erupted, flashbulbs popped, hands clapped her back, voices congratulated, reporters jotted notes with reverence. But as the metal gleamed against her chest, felt the weight of it sinking like an anchor. The metal was cool against her skin, but it burned in her mind, because she hadn't felt like valor. She hadn't felt like resilience. She had felt fear, desperation, and the constant dread of failure. She hadn't thought of heroism, only of breathing, of stopping blood, of buying one more minute for men who deserved more than minutes. And in the quiet after the ceremony, when the crowd dispersed and the uniforms blurred back into duty, she stood alone, staring at the medal. For the first time, she whispered aloud what her chest had carried for months. "I didn't save them. They saved me, because if they died, I'd never forgive myself." Her reflection in the mirror didn't answer. The military called it recognition. The press called it bravery. Her men called it survival, but called it something else: burden. When she returned to her quarters that night, she laid the medal on the desk and sat in silence. Her ribs had healed, the cut on her brow faded, but the weight inside her had only grown. She replayed the moment she was marched out of the bunker at gunpoint. The Way's bandaged face had looked at her as if asking if she'd ever return. The guilt of leaving, even temporarily, gnawed deeper than any scar. She began writing, not reports, not speeches, notes, fragments, memories scrawled in a journal no one else would ever see. 4:03 a.m. The blast threw me into the cabinet. My ears rang for hours. I thought I'd die before I stood again. Corporal, soot streaked his face when he said the command post was gone. His voice still cracks in my dreams. Private asked about ground troops while his head bled. Even concussed, he thought of defense before himself. His chest wound, the smell of burning insulation in the bunker. I still taste it when I drink water. Each entry bled into the next, until pages filled with a story no metal could capture. Her men recovered slowly, scattered across hospitals and rehab centers. Some returned to active duty, others discharged with scars they would carry forever. But each of them reached out to her, letters, phone calls, sometimes visits. They called her ma'am, sometimes doc, sometimes simply Angel. "Because you dragged me out when the roof was falling," had said during one visit, his smile crooked beneath his scars. "You're the reason I still breathe, Captain." Smiled politely, but inside the words twisted. She wanted to tell him she hadn't dragged him out alone, that it was his brothers carrying stretchers, that it was luck the tunnel held, that it was timing more than skill. But she never corrected them. She simply nodded, offering comfort instead of confession. Because how could she admit the truth? That she didn't feel like an angel. She felt like a survivor who had stitched life together with trembling hands and prayed it didn't unravel. The military turned into a case study. Analysts wrote about her triage under fire, her improvisation with maintenance tools, her negotiation with. They built training modules around her decisions. Young medics sat in classrooms watching slides of her bunker, her methods, her choices. One day, invited to speak before a new group of recruits, she stood at the podium, eyes scanning fresh faces filled with eagerness. They expected inspiration. They expected stories of triumph. But didn't give them glory, she gave them truth. "You will hear words like courage, valor, heroism," she told them, her voice low but firm. "But in the field you won't feel like heroes. You'll feel fear. You'll feel exhaustion. You'll feel like every decision you make is a gamble and every mistake costs a life. And sometimes you'll hate yourself for surviving when others didn't." The room was silent, the air heavy. "But listen to me," she continued, her throat tightening. The job isn't about feeling like heroes. It's about keeping someone breathing long enough to see another sunrise. That's all. That's everything. Somewhere in the back, a recruit wiped his eyes. She knew then her words had landed where they were meant to, not on medals, not in history, but in the hearts of those who would soon face their own. Still, when the applause followed, when instructors praised her honesty, walked out alone, because nothing eased the weight. One evening found her in the quiet of the base chapel, the silver star clutched in her hand. She didn't notice him at first, her head bowed, her lips moving in silent thought. "You're harder on yourself than anyone else could be," he said softly. She looked up startled. "Sir." "Do sir me right now," he interrupted gently. "Just listen." He stepped closer, his voice low. "Those men went home because of you. You see ghosts. I see 18 families that still have fathers, brothers, sons. That's your legacy, Captain. Not the base we lost, the lives we didn't." Her eyes burned. She wanted to believe him, but she only whispered the words she carried like chains. "I left them, even if only for hours. I left them." Shook his head. "You came back. That's the only part that matters." For the first time, she didn't argue. That night she placed the silver star back in its case. She didn't wear it often, but she didn't hide it either. It wasn't pride. It wasn't shame. It was a reminder. A reminder that sometimes survival feels like failure. A reminder that sometimes the only difference between despair and redemption is refusing to quit. And though she couldn't yet name it, the seeds of something new were growing in her, the realization that her story wasn't finished. That wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. What if the hardest battles aren't fought in fire but in classrooms? Months after, Captain Angel stood before rows of recruits at Fort's medical training facility. The air smelled of antiseptic and paper, not smoke and blood. Instead of shellfire, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The recruits were young, fresh-faced, their uniforms crisp, their eyes wide with a mixture of eagerness and fear. They weren't yet soldiers of war. They were students, dreamers, hopefuls. Adjusted the collar of her uniform, feeling the weight of eyes on her. The silver star gleamed faintly at her chest, though she rarely wore it. The instructors had insisted this time. "They need to see what survival looks like," they'd said. Survival, she still hated the word. Her voice carried steady, though her heart tightened with every syllable. "You've read manuals. You've studied anatomy. You know the names of bones and veins. But none of that will prepare you for the moment the roof caves in and the only light you have is a dying flashlight. None of it will prepare you for when the radio goes dead and you have 18 men looking at you like you're their last chance." The recruits leaned forward, pen scratching, eyes locked. Paused, letting silence speak for her. Then she lowered her voice. "Medicine in the field is not clean, it's not neat. It's blood on your boots, sweat in your eyes, smoke in your lungs. It's making impossible choices in seconds. Who to save first, who to let go, and it's living with those choices afterward." Her words didn't come from a script. They came from nights spent staring at ceilings, from mornings where the sound of a car backfiring made her heart slam into her ribs. They came from. She moved closer to the recruits, her boots clicking softly on the floor. "I don't tell you this to scare you. I tell you this because when the moment comes, you will be scared. And that's normal. What matters is what you do anyway. What matters is that you steady your hands, you breathe, and you remember your oath. Keep them alive." One young woman in the front row raised her hand, her voice hesitant. "Ma'am, how do you know when you've done enough? When you've succeeded?" Looked at her, the question cutting deep. She thought of gasping in the bunker. She thought of Cole's fever burning hotter by the minute. She thought of the faces she didn't save, names that weren't carved into medals but into graves. Her answer came softly, almost like a confession. "You don't. You never really know. Success isn't measured in how many you saved, but in the fact that you didn't quit, even when everything in you wanted to. That's the only measure that matters." The recruits scribbled notes but wasn't sure if they could capture the weight in her voice. Some lessons couldn't be written. They had to be lived. After class, a young man lingered, his hands fumbling with his notebook. "Captain," he asked quietly, "my brother, he didn't make it back from Kandahar. His medic tried everything, but it wasn't enough. I guess I just want to know, does that mean he failed?" The question broke her heart. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "No, he didn't fail. Sometimes, no matter what we do, it's not enough. But what matters is he tried. That's not failure. That's the definition of service." The recruit's eyes watered, and he nodded, clutching her words like a lifeline. Moments like that were harder than in some ways. Because here, she wasn't fighting to stop bleeding. She was fighting despair, fear, the ghosts that haunted not just her but every medic who dared to care in war. At night, after the classes ended and the lights dimmed, often stayed behind in the training bay. She walked between the practice dummies and empty stretchers, her fingers grazing plastic limbs and metal rails. She heard echoes of voices in the silence, questions, Cole's fevered murmurs, gasps. Sometimes she spoke aloud as if they were still listening. "I tell them the truth. I tell them what it felt like. I hope it's enough." In those quiet hours, she realized something. Teaching was another kind of triage. She couldn't go back to, she couldn't erase what happened, but she could prepare others. She could give them the tools to survive their own infernos. And maybe, just maybe, that was how she would heal. One day, visited during a lecture. He stood at the back, arms crossed, watching her pace before the recruits. When the class ended, he approached, his voice low. "You've found your place, Captain. These men and women will carry your lessons into battles we can't yet see." Tilted her head, weary but resolute. "I just want them ready." Studied her. "You're giving them more than readiness. You're giving them resilience. And that's rarer than skill." She didn't argue. She simply nodded, though her heart carried the same quiet doubt. Was resilience really something you could teach, or only something you earned in fire? Later that week, one of her former patients, Private, surprised her with a visit. His head still bore faint scars beneath trimmed hair, but his smile was stronger. He stood at the doorway of her classroom, watching her as the recruits filed out. "You really don't stop, do you?" he teased softly. Smiled faintly. "If I stop, the memories catch up. This keeps them at bay." Nodded, his eyes glistening. "You saved us, Captain. I hope you know that." She swallowed hard, her voice breaking. "I just kept you breathing." "That's saving," he said firmly. "Don't forget it." For the first time in months, allowed herself to believe the words, just a little. That night as she left the facility, she paused beneath the fatting sky. The air was cool, the stars faint behind city lights. She closed her eyes and whispered, not a prayer but a vow. "I'll keep teaching, as long as it takes, because someone out there will face what I faced, and they deserve to know they're not alone." Her ghosts didn't vanish. They never would. But for the first time, they didn't feel like chains. They felt like companions, reminders of why she still stood, why she still spoke, why she still carried the story of. Because sometimes, survival wasn't about medals or history. Sometimes, survival was about making sure the next medic knew how to steady their hands when the world collapsed, what remains when the medals tarnish and the applause fades. For Captain Angel, the answer was quieter than anyone expected. It wasn't the silver star gleaming in a display case, or her name in official reports, or even the stories told in training halls. What remained was something less visible but more enduring. The memory of fire, the faces of men she refused to abandon, and the knowledge that service isn't about glory, it's about presence. Years after, she found herself standing at another base. Not in the middle of war this time, but at a graduation ceremony for combat medics she had trained. The recruits stood tall in crisp uniforms, their families cheering from folding chairs, sunlight spilling across the parade ground. Pride shone in their eyes, but beneath it she saw something else too: readiness, resilience, the hard-earned understanding that medicine in war was as much about will as skill. As she watched them march, she felt a strange ache, not sadness, not joy, but something in between. These young medics would go out into a world that still bled, still burned. Some would come back, some might not come back at all, but they would go armed with more than kits and manuals. They would carry the truth she had given them, that fear was normal, that failure haunted, but that quitting was never an option. After the ceremony, a young woman approached her, uniform pressed sharp, eyes bright with questions. "Captain," she said nervously, "do you ever stop being afraid?" Looked at her for a long moment, the echo of burning in her mind. She could still hear the first blast, still see gasping, still feel the barrel of an enemy rifle pointed past her shoulder. Fear had never left her. It never would. "No," answered softly. "You don't stop being afraid, but you learn to move anyway." The recruit nodded, absorbing the weight of it, and in her eyes saw something she recognized, the same fragile determination she had once carried into fire. That night returned to her quarters. The metal case sat on her desk, untouched for weeks. She opened it, running her fingers lightly over the silver star. Once it had felt like a burden, a reminder of ghosts she couldn't outrun. Now it felt different, still heavy but less like chains, more like a stone she had chosen to carry not for herself but for those who couldn't. She thought of Cole, all 18 men who had walked out of alive because they believed in her, because they trusted her hands when everything else fell apart. She thought of the ones she hadn't saved that night, their names unspoken but not forgotten. She thought of Major, and how even the enemy had seen her worth as a medic, even when he tried to use it against her. Most of all, she thought of the moment she stood alone in the bunker doorway, facing rifles with nothing but her voice. That moment defined her more than any medal, any speech, any training session, because in that instant she had no armor, no weapons, no certainty. She had only dignity, and it was enough. She closed the metal case gently and stood at the window. Outside, the night sky stretched wide and quiet, no smoke, no fire, only stars. She breathed slowly, letting the silence fill her. Her life had changed since. She was no longer just a medic patching wounds in the dark. She was a teacher, a mentor, a living reminder that survival is never clean, never easy, but always worth fighting for. The scars inside her remained, but they no longer owned her. They shaped her. And as she turned from the window, she whispered words she had never spoken aloud before. "It wasn't about me. It was about them, always about them." Because the truth of wasn't written in medals or reports. It was written in 18 breaths that continued because one medic refused to leave. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.